In the rolling hills of rural Maryland, there exists a cemetery where shadows fall in places where no object casts them. These dark patches appear at midday under the brightest sun, marking the earth in patterns that have remained unchanged for over 30 years. Local residents whisper that these shadows never move, never fade, and seem to seep from the ground itself like permanent stains on the world. Before we uncover the terrifying truth behind Hallowed Ground Cemetery, I want to ask you to subscribe to our channel, hit that like button if you enjoy these dark mysteries, and tell us in the comments what city and country you're watching from. Your support helps us bring you more spine-chilling stories from America's hidden past. What makes these shadows so disturbing isn't just their permanence, but what lies buried beneath them. According to fragmented records and whispered testimonies passed down through generations, the truth behind Hallowed Ground Cemetery would shake the very foundations of how we remember one of America's bloodiest conflicts. The small town of Millbrook, Maryland, had always been a quiet farming community, nestled between rolling wheat fields and dense oak forests. In 1890, with a population barely reaching 400 souls, it was the kind of place where everyone knew their neighbor's business, and Sunday church services drew nearly every resident. The town had weathered the Civil War years with minimal direct conflict, serving primarily as a supply route for Union forces moving between Baltimore and Washington. Hallowed Ground Cemetery sat on a gentle slope just outside the town limits, established in 1867 as the final resting place for Millbrook's departed. The cemetery covered roughly 3 acres of well-maintained grounds, with neat rows of headstones dating back to the town's founding families. White oak trees provided shade over the older sections, while newer graves occupied the sunnier eastern slope. A low stone wall surrounded the property, with an iron gate that creaked in the persistent Maryland winds. Abraham Hollow had served as the cemetery's caretaker since its establishment. A man of 52 with calloused hands and a permanently stooped posture from decades of digging, Abraham took pride in maintaining the sacred grounds. His small cottage sat adjacent to the cemetery, allowing him to keep constant watch over the resting place of Millbrook's citizens. Abraham had served briefly in the 54th Maryland Infantry during the war, returning home with a slight limp and a deep respect for the dead. The townsfolk considered Abraham a reliable, if somewhat solitary figure. He attended Sunday services at the Methodist Church, kept his grounds immaculate, and rarely spoke unless spoken to. His wife Sarah had died of consumption 3 years earlier, leaving him alone with his duties and his memories. The only family he had left was his nephew Thomas, who worked at the lumber mill and visited occasionally to help with heavier maintenance tasks. Maryland in 1890 was still healing from the war's aftermath. The state had remained in the Union despite significant Confederate sympathies, creating lasting tensions in rural communities. Former soldiers from both sides sometimes found themselves neighbors, their wartime allegiances buried beneath the necessity of rebuilding their lives. Millbrook had managed this delicate balance better than most, but conversations about the war years remained careful and measured. The morning of September 15, 1890, dawned clear and uncommonly warm for late September. Abraham began his daily rounds as usual, checking for any damage from the previous night's wind and preparing for a burial scheduled that afternoon. Old Mrs. Patterson had finally succumbed to her long illness, and her family had requested a plot in the newer section of the cemetery. As Abraham walked through the familiar rows of headstones, something caught his attention that made him stop mid-step. In several spots throughout the cemetery, dark patches marked the ground in irregular shapes, each roughly the size of a man lying prone. These weren't shadows cast by trees or monuments, for the sun was high and bright, and the dark areas appeared in locations where no objects could possibly create such patterns. Abraham rubbed his eyes, certain that fatigue was playing tricks on his vision, but the dark patches remained, clearly visible against the lighter grass. He approached the nearest one, located between two modest headstones in the older section. The grass in this area appeared healthy, but somehow darker, as if stained by something that had penetrated deep into the soil. When he knelt and examined the earth more closely, the grass felt normal to the touch, yet the discoloration was unmistakable. Moving through the cemetery, Abraham counted 8 such patches scattered across the grounds. Each maintained the same general shape and size, and each appeared in areas where he had worked for over 20 years without ever noticing anything unusual. The patterns seemed random at first glance, but as he studied them more carefully, Abraham realized they formed a rough line from the cemetery's western edge toward the center. That afternoon, as Mrs. Patterson's funeral procession wound its way up the hill, Abraham found himself distracted by the mysterious patches. During the service, he caught several mourners glancing nervously at the dark spots, though no one commented directly. After the burial, Mrs. Patterson's son approached Abraham with a troubled expression. "Mr. Hollow," the younger man said quietly, "my mother mentioned something strange about this place before she passed. Said she'd heard stories from the old-timers about things that happened here during the war. You've been here longer than most. You ever hear anything like that?" Abraham shook his head, but the question lodged itself in his mind like a splinter. That evening, he walked the cemetery grounds again as the sun set, noting that the dark patches remained visible even in the fading light, as if they absorbed rather than reflected the day's last rays. Word of the mysterious shadows spread through Millbrook with the speed of all small-town gossip, though most residents attributed them to natural causes, perhaps mineral deposits in the soil or some peculiar effect of the unusually dry summer. Abraham found himself fielding questions from curious visitors, all of whom wanted to see the phenomenon for themselves. Dr. Morrison, the town's physician and one of its most educated residents, examined the patches with scientific interest. He tested the soil's composition and measured the areas carefully, but could offer no immediate explanation. "The grass appears healthy," he told Abraham, "but there's definitely some kind of staining in the earth itself. I've never seen anything quite like it." As autumn deepened, the dark patches not only persisted, but seemed to become more pronounced. Abraham began keeping a journal, noting changes in the patterns and recording comments from visitors. Several elderly residents mentioned fragments of stories they'd heard about the cemetery's land during the war years, but their memories were vague and contradictory. It was Thomas, Abraham's nephew, who first brought substantial information. During a visit in late October, he mentioned a conversation he'd had with Jake Morrison, an old railroad worker who'd been drinking at Murphy's Tavern. "Uncle Abe," Thomas said as they sat in the cottage's small kitchen, "Jake was talking about his grandfather, who worked for the military during the war. Said the old man used to tell stories about secret things that happened around here, things that were never supposed to be talked about. Jake's grandfather claimed there were places where soldiers took care of problems that couldn't be handled through regular channels." Abraham set down his coffee cup with a sharp clink. "What kind of problems?" "Deserters, spies, people who knew too much about troop movements. Jake's grandfather said there were orders that came from high up, orders that didn't leave paper trails. Men would disappear, and officially they'd never existed." The conversation troubled Abraham deeply. That night, he found himself standing in the cemetery, staring at the dark patches under the pale October moon. For the first time, he noticed that the patches were positioned in a way that would have provided clear sightlines from multiple directions, perfect for activities that required both secrecy and efficiency. Abraham's investigation began in earnest the following week. He started by examining the cemetery's original land records, housed in the county clerk's office in the nearest large town. The documents revealed that the cemetery had been established on land previously owned by the federal government, purchased at an unusually low price in 1867, just 2 years after the war's end. More intriguing was a notation in the margin of one document, written in faded ink. Land use restrictions lifted as of June 1867, previous federal requirements no longer applicable. Abraham copied the notation carefully, wondering what federal requirements could have applied to seemingly empty farmland. His next stop was the local Veterans of Foreign Wars post, where several Civil War veterans gathered regularly to share stories and play cards. Abraham approached them carefully, knowing that wartime memories could be sensitive subjects. Most of the men remembered the area being restricted during certain periods of the conflict, but attributed this to its proximity to supply routes. However, one veteran, a former sergeant named William Hayes, who had served with military police units, pulled Abraham aside after the others had left. "You're asking about that land where your cemetery sits," Hayes said quietly. "I was hoping someone would eventually ask the right questions. There's things that happened there that weren't right, things that still bother me after all these years." Hayes explained that during 1863 and 1864, military police units had used isolated locations throughout Maryland to handle what they termed security issues. These locations were chosen for their remoteness and their proximity to major supply lines, where sensitive information was most likely to be compromised. "There were men who deserted, sure," Hayes continued, "but there were also men who saw things they shouldn't have seen, or who asked too many questions about supply shortages and missing equipment. Some of these men were dealing with Confederate agents, but others were just in the wrong place at the wrong time." Abraham pressed for more details, and Hayes revealed that the area now occupied by Hollowed Ground Cemetery had been used as what military police euphemistically called a field interrogation site. Men brought there rarely returned to their units, and their names often disappeared from official rosters entirely. "The thing is," Hayes said, lowering his voice further, "some of those executions weren't authorized by proper military tribunals. There were officers who took it upon themselves to eliminate problems, and they had enough rank to make their actions seem official. After the war, there was pressure to keep those activities quiet to avoid embarrassing the Union cause." Armed with this information, Abraham returned to the cemetery with new eyes. The 8 dark patches now took on a more sinister significance. He began measuring and mapping their locations, creating a detailed sketch that he kept hidden in his cottage. The patches were indeed positioned strategically, with clear sightlines and easy access from what would have been a road during the 1860s. Abraham's investigation took a dangerous turn when he decided to excavate carefully around one of the smaller patches. Working late at night to avoid detection, he dug a shallow trench along the edge of the darkest staining. 3 feet down, his shovel struck something that was definitely not stone or root. Under the pale light of a lantern, Abraham uncovered fragments of rusted metal, pieces that looked suspiciously like uniform buttons and belt buckles. More disturbing were the bone fragments, clearly human, scattered throughout the disturbed earth. Most chilling of all was a piece of cloth that had somehow survived the decades, bearing what appeared to be sergeant's stripes. Before he could process this discovery fully, Abraham heard footsteps approaching through the cemetery. He quickly covered his excavation and extinguished his lantern, crouching behind the nearest headstone. 2 figures approached, their voices carrying clearly in the still night air. "The old man's been asking too many questions," one voice said. Abraham recognized it as belonging to Colonel Marcus Webb, a prominent local businessman who claimed to have served with distinction during the war. "Should have expected this eventually," replied the second man, whom Abraham couldn't identify. "Someone was bound to notice those stains sooner or later. The question is how much he knows and who he's told." Hayes has been running his mouth at the veterans' meetings. If he's told the gravedigger about the executions, we have a problem. There are still people alive who could verify those stories, and there are documents that weren't destroyed. Abraham's blood ran cold as he realized the implications. These men weren't just discussing historical events. They were actively working to keep them secret. The conversation continued for several more minutes, with references to maintaining order and protecting reputations. that made Abraham increasingly nervous about his own safety. After the men left, Abraham sat in his cottage until dawn, staring at the sketches and notes he'd accumulated. The evidence was becoming undeniable. Hollowed Ground Cemetery was built on a mass grave, and there were people willing to commit violence to keep that fact hidden. The confrontation Abraham had been dreading came sooner than expected. 3 days after his nighttime encounter, Colonel Webb appeared at the cemetery during Abraham's morning rounds, accompanied by 2 men Abraham didn't recognize. Webb's demeanor was friendly, but carried an underlying threat that made Abraham's skin crawl. "Mr. Hollow," Webb said with a practiced smile, "I understand you've been taking quite an interest in local history lately. Admirable curiosity, though sometimes the past is better left buried, if you'll pardon the expression." Abraham straightened his shoulders, meeting Webb's gaze directly. "Just doing my job, Colonel. Maintaining the grounds, making sure everything's proper and respectful." "Of course," Webb replied. But there have been reports of unauthorized digging, late-night activities that might disturb the peace of this sacred place. We wouldn't want anything to compromise the dignity of our cemetery, would we?" The threat was clear, but Abraham had made his decision during the long, sleepless night following his discovery. "Colonel, I think the dignity of this place was compromised long before I started asking questions. Those dark patches aren't going away, and people are starting to notice. Sooner or later, someone's going to want official answers." Webb's friendly facade dropped entirely. "Mr. Hollow, you're a veteran yourself. You understand the necessities of war, the difficult decisions that had to be made to preserve the Union. Some secrets exist not to hide wrongdoing, but to protect the honor of men who made impossible choices in impossible times." "And what about the honor of the men buried here without proper rights or recognition?" Abraham shot back. "What about their families, who never knew what happened to their sons and husbands?" The colonel stepped closer, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Those men were traitors and spies, Abraham. They betrayed their country and paid the appropriate price. The officers who carried out those executions were patriots acting under extreme circumstances. Exposing their actions now would serve no purpose except to tarnish the memory of the Union cause." Abraham realized with growing horror that Webb wasn't just protecting historical secrets. He had been directly involved in the executions. The colonel's intimate knowledge of events and his desperate need to maintain secrecy could only mean one thing. He had been one of the officers who had ordered or carried out the killings. "You were there," Abraham said quietly. "You were one of them." Webb's silence confirmed Abraham's suspicion. After a long moment, the colonel spoke again, his voice heavy with what might have been regret or simply frustration at being discovered. "Lieutenant Webb, as I was then, followed orders and protected military secrets during a time of national crisis. The men who died here had compromised Union security and endangered thousands of loyal soldiers. Their executions prevented Confederate forces from learning critical information about troop movements and supply lines. The truth, when it finally emerged, was both simpler and more complex than Abraham had imagined. Webb's confession, delivered with the resignation of a man who had carried his burden for nearly 3 decades, revealed that between 1863 and 1864, 8 men had been executed at the site that would later become Hollowed Ground Cemetery. Some had been deserters caught selling information to Confederate agents. Others had been Union soldiers who had discovered evidence of corruption in the supply chain and threatened to expose officers who were profiteering from military contracts. One had been a civilian contractor who had learned too much about troop movements and was deemed a security risk. The executions had been carried out by firing squad, with the bodies buried immediately in unmarked graves. The blood that soaked into the earth during those grim proceedings had indeed stained the soil permanently, creating chemical changes that affected plant growth for decades to come. The dark patches weren't supernatural phenomena. They were the physical legacy of violence, preserved in the earth itself. Webb revealed that military records had been falsified to show the men as missing in action or transferred to other units. Their families had never learned the truth about their fate, instead living with the uncertainty of not knowing whether their loved ones were alive or dead. The conspiracy to hide these events had involved multiple officers and had continued long after the war's end. When the land was selected for the cemetery, Webb and his associates had seen it as a form of poetic justice. The men they had killed for betraying the Union would be joined in death by loyal citizens of the community they had supposedly endangered. Abraham faced an impossible choice. Exposing the truth would provide closure for the families of the executed men, but those families were long dead themselves. It would also destroy the reputations of men who had convinced themselves they were patriots, and potentially invalidate the sacred ground where generations of Millbrook residents had been laid to rest. In the end, Abraham chose a middle path. He compiled detailed records of his discoveries and Webb's confession, sealing them in a metal box that he buried in his own backyard. He also sent copies to his nephew Thomas with instructions that they be opened only if something happened to him or if future generations needed to understand the truth about Hallowed Ground Cemetery. The dark patches remained visible in the cemetery, a permanent reminder of secrets that had shaped the community's history. Abraham continued his duties as caretaker, but with a new understanding of the weight carried by the ground, he tended. Sometimes, on quiet mornings when the light fell just right, he would stand among the headstones and wonder if the shadows that lingered there were truly just stains in the soil, or something more, the persistent echo of injustice demanding to be remembered. The mystery of Hallowed Ground Cemetery reminds us that beneath the ordered surfaces of our communities lie the complex moral choices made by previous generations. The shadows that refuse to fade serve as testimony to the truth that some stains on history are too deep to wash away, and that the price of maintaining secrets can echo through generations long after those who created them have passed into memory themselves. What do you think about this dark chapter of Civil War history? Do you believe there are other places like Hallowed Ground Cemetery where the sins of the past have left permanent marks on the landscape? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this story and want to hear more mysteries from America's hidden past, subscribe to our channel, hit the notification bell, and share this video with someone who loves historical mysteries. Until next time, remember that the past is never as buried as we might think.